The gunshots echoed across the vast expanse of prairie as Katherine Rose clutched her swollen belly and dove behind the overturned wagon, her heart pounding with terror not just for herself, but for the unborn child she had promised her late husband she would protect with her life. Montana Territory, 1876. The journey west had been Katherine's last hope after burying James 4 months ago, leaving her alone in the world save for the child growing inside her. The small homestead outside of Willow Creek, Montana Territory, had been her destination, a parcel of land left to her husband by a distant uncle, which now represented her only chance at a future. The stagecoach had dropped her at the nearest town, and the kind shopkeeper had arranged for a local farmer to take her the final 15 miles to her property. That's when the outlaws struck. "Hand over whatever valuables you got, lady." The rough voice belonged to a man with a scarred face and rotted teeth, his pistol aimed directly at her hiding spot. Katherine pressed herself against the hard-packed earth, mind racing. The farmer who'd offered to drive her had already been shot, his body lying motionless near the horses. Blood stained the dusty ground beneath him. The outlaws, 3 of them that she could count, were now circling the wagon like vultures. "Ain't got all day, woman," another shouted. "We know you city folk always carry something worth tackin'." She had nothing of value except her wedding band, and the meager savings sewn into the lining of her dress, enough to establish herself until the baby came, but not enough to interest bandits. Yet she knew they wouldn't believe that, and worse, she knew what men like these might do to a woman alone. The baby kicked inside her as if sensing her fear. Katherine closed her eyes, trying to control her breathing. The spring sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down her back despite the relative coolness of the April afternoon. "I said come out." The first outlaw's voice was closer now. A boot appeared at the edge of her vision. Katherine pressed herself harder against the wagon, wishing she could disappear into the weathered wood. The outlaw reached down, his filthy hand grabbing for her arm. The shot rang out so suddenly that Katherine couldn't help the scream that escaped her lips. But it wasn't her who had been hit. The outlaw fell backward, clutching his shoulder, cursing violently. "Back away from the lady," came a deep, steady voice from somewhere beyond her vision. "Who the hell?" The second outlaw's words were cut off by another shot that splintered the wagon wood inches from his head. "That was a warning," the voice continued. "The next one won't miss. Now back away." Katherine dared to peek around the edge of the wagon. A rider sat atop a magnificent chestnut horse about 50 yards away, rifle raised steadily in his hands. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but his posture spoke of absolute confidence. "There's 3 of us and 1 of you, mister," the third outlaw called out, though he'd already begun edging toward his horse. "I count 2.5, the stranger replied, nodding toward the wounded man still writhing on the ground. "And I've got 16 bullets. Seems like poor odds for you boys." The standoff lasted only seconds longer before the outlaws made their decision. The 2 uninjured men hauled their wounded companion onto his horse, mounted their own, and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and curses behind them. Katherine remained frozen, uncertain if this newcomer represented salvation or a different kind of danger. He dismounted in one fluid motion and approached slowly, his rifle now lowered but still in his hands. As he drew closer, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall, with broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist. His face, now visible beneath the brim of his hat, was weathered by sun and wind, but handsome in a rugged way. Dark blonde hair touched his collar, and his eyes were a startling blue against his tanned skin. "Madam, are you hurt?" His voice was gentler now, tinged with concern. Katherine realized she was still cowering behind the wagon and forced herself to stand, one hand protectively over her belly. I'm not injured," she managed, though her voice shook. His eyes took in her condition immediately, widening slightly at the sight of her pregnancy. "Name's Thomas Lawson," he said, tipping his hat. "Most folks call me Tucker." "Katherine Rose," she replied, then glanced at the body of the farmer. "He was just trying to help me get to my property." Tucker followed her gaze, his expression somber. "I'm sorry about that, Mrs. Rose. That's Ed Harris. He was a good man. You knew him. I know most folks around these parts." He glanced in the direction the outlaws had fled. "And I know those men too, the Blackwater gang. They've been terrorizing this territory for months now." Katherine felt her knees weaken as the reality of what had just happened, what could have happened, washed over her. Tucker was at her side instantly, offering a steadying arm. "Easy now. Let's get you sitting down proper." He guided her to a flat rock, then returned to the wagon, riding a canteen that had fallen during the attack. He brought it to her and waited as she drank. "Thank you," she said finally, "for the water and for saving my life. Don't mention it." He surveyed the overturned wagon, the scattered belongings, the dead farmer. "You said you were headed to your property. Where might that be?" Katherine explained about the homestead left to her husband, about James's death from pneumonia back in St. Louis, and her decision to come west rather than return to her parents who had disowned her for marrying a man they considered beneath her. "That'd be the old Frederick's place, about 5 miles north of here," Tucker said when she finished. "Been empty for years." "Is it habitable?" Katherine had pictured a small but solid cabin, something she could make into a home. Tucker hesitated. "It'll need work, but the structure's sound enough." He looked at her again, at her city clothes and delicate hands that had clearly never done a day of hard labor. "Mrs. Rose, forgive my bluntness, but that's no place for a woman in your condition to be alone." "I have nowhere else to go," she said simply. He nodded, seeming to understand the finality of her situation. "Well, first things first. We need to take care of Ed, get your things collected, and find you some shelter before nightfall." He glanced at the sky. "We've got maybe 3 hours of daylight left." Tucker set about the grim business of wrapping Ed's body in a blanket and securing it across the man's own horse. Then he righted Katherine's wagon, gathered her scattered possessions, and hitched up the team again. All the while, he moved with the efficient grace of a man accustomed to handling emergencies, pausing occasionally to scan the horizon as if expecting the outlaws to return. "Can you drive a wagon?" he asked when everything was ready. Katherine nodded. Though she'd grown up privileged, her father had insisted she learn basic skills, driving among them. "Good. I'll ride alongside. We'll take Ed to the undertaker in Willow Creek, then head to your place before dark." The trip to town was somber, Katherine's thoughts torn between grief for the kind farmer who'd lost his life helping her and anxiety about what awaited her at the homestead. Tucker rode silently beside the wagon, alert and watchful. Willow Creek proved to be little more than a collection of wooden buildings strung along a single dusty street, a general store, saloon, small church, and a few other establishments. Their arrival with Ed's body caused an immediate stir, and soon they were surrounded by concerned townspeople. Tucker explained the situation in terse sentences, identifying the attackers as the Blackwater gang. The town marshal, a grizzled man named Peterson, took notes and promised to send a telegram to the territorial authorities, though his expression suggested little hope of capturing the outlaws. "They'll be across the border by sundown," he said grimly. "Been trying to catch those boys for months." Ed's body was taken to the undertaker, and arrangements were made for his burial. Katherine insisted on contributing what she could toward the cost, despite Tucker's protests. "He died helping me," she said firmly. "It's the least I can do." By the time they left town, heading north toward her property, the sun was already low in the sky. Katherine's back ached from the tension and the jolting of the wagon, and she couldn't help but worry about the effect of the day's stress on her baby. "How much further?" she asked as they crossed a shallow creek. "Just beyond that rise," Tucker replied, pointing to a gentle hill ahead. "You'll be able to see it from there." When they crested the hill, Katherine's heart sank. Below them sat a small, weathered cabin with a sagging porch and what appeared to be a partially collapsed roof on one side. A barn stood nearby in similar condition, and the surrounding fields were overgrown with weeds and young saplings. "Oh," was all she could manage. Tucker watched her face carefully. "It's not as bad as it looks," he offered, though his tone lacked conviction. "The main room is sound. It just needs some care." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes despite her best efforts to control them. This derelict homestead was so far from the fresh start she had imagined, from the safe haven she had promised her unborn child. "Mrs. Rose Katherine," Tucker said gently, "I know this isn't what you were hoping for, but we can make it habitable for tonight and tomorrow." "Well, tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." She wiped her eyes, embarrassed by her moment of weakness. "I'm sorry, it's been a difficult day." "You've nothing to apologize for. You've shown more courage than most men I know, facing what you have." The simple kindness in his words nearly undid her again, but Katherine squared her shoulders and nodded. "Then let's see what we're dealing with." Tucker helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Up close, the cabin looked slightly better than it had from a distance. The logs were solid if weathered, and the porch, while sagging at one corner, wasn't in danger of immediate collapse. Inside, dust and cobwebs covered everything, but the floor was sound and the roof leaked only in the far corner of the single room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a bed frame with a rotted mattress remained from the previous occupants. "It's not so terrible," Katherine said, trying to convince herself as much as Tucker. He made a noncommittal sound, already moving about the cabin, checking the integrity of the walls and the functionality of the fireplace. "Let's get a fire going before it gets any colder," he said. "I'll bring in your things and see about that roof." While Tucker unloaded the wagon and tended to the horses, Katherine set about clearing away the worst of the dust and cobwebs. It was mindless work that allowed her thoughts to wander. What had seemed like a solution, a fresh start in a new place, now felt like another impossible challenge. How was she to manage this place alone, especially with a baby coming? By the time Tucker returned, arms laden with her trunks, Katherine had swept the floor clean and laid fresh kindling in the fireplace. He nodded approvingly, set down her belongings, and knelt to light the fire. "I've put your horses in the barn," he said as flames began to catch. "The structure's solid enough, though the corral fence needs work. There's a pump out back that still draws water, and I found some old tools in the lean-to." "Thank you," Katherine said, suddenly aware of how much this stranger had done for her in the span of a few hours. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along when you did." Tucker shrugged, seeming uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just happened to be in the right place." He stood, brushing his hands on his pants. "I'm going to see about patching that roof before we lose the light completely." Katherine watched him go, then turned to the challenge of making the cabin livable for the night. She found sheets in one of her trunks and covered the old bed frame, creating a place to sleep. From another trunk, she retrieved cooking utensils and the provisions she'd purchased in Willow Creek before setting out. By the time Tucker returned, she had a pot of beans simmering over the fire and cornbread baking in a small Dutch oven. "Something smells good," he said, ducking through the doorway. His shirt was damp with sweat, and there was a smudge of dirt across his forehead. "It's not much," Katherine replied, suddenly self-conscious. "But I thought you might be hungry. I'd be grateful for anything hot." He moved to the basin she'd filled with water from the pump and washed his hands and face. "Roof's patched for now. It'll hold against anything short of a downpour." They ate at the small table, the firelight casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Katherine found herself studying Tucker as he ate. Despite his rough exterior, there was a gentleness to him, evident in the way he'd handled her throughout this ordeal and in the careful way he spoke, never raising his voice or making sudden movements that might startle her. "You've been very kind," she said finally, "but I've kept you from your own business all day. Surely you have somewhere to be." Tucker shook his head. "Nothing that can't wait." He hesitated, then added, "Truth is, Mrs. Rose, I'm not comfortable leaving you out here alone, especially after what happened today. You think they might come back, the Outlaws? It's possible. The Blackwater gang has a reputation for holding grudges, and I put a bullet in one of them." He studied her face, his expression serious. "But even if they don't, this is no place for a woman in your condition to be alone. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles away and town's a good hour's ride." Katherine felt a flutter of fear. "What do you suggest?" "I could stay a few days. Help get the place in better shape. Make sure you're safe." He must have seen the hesitation in her eyes, for he quickly added, "I'd sleep in the barn, of course. I wouldn't want to compromise your reputation." The idea of having him nearby was undeniably comforting, but Katherine was wary of accepting so much help from a man she'd just met. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Tucker was quiet for a moment, his gaze dropping to his plate. "My sister was in a similar situation once. Widowed, expecting. She didn't have anyone to help her." He looked up, and there was a sadness in his eyes that spoke of old pain. "I was too far away to reach her in time. She and the baby both died during a winter storm." "I'm so sorry," Katherine whispered, understanding now the depth of his concern. "It was a long time ago, but I swore I'd never stand by if I could help someone in need." He cleared his throat. "So if you'll permit it, I'd like to stay until I'm sure you're safe." Katherine considered his offer. The practical part of her recognized that she desperately needed help, and Tucker had proven himself trustworthy. The more cautious part worried about the implications of a single man staying with a widow, even if he slept in the barn. But the baby chose that moment to kick vigorously, as if casting a vote, and Katherine made her decision. "I would be grateful for your help, Mr. Lawson." "Tucker," he corrected with a slight smile, "and I'm happy to do it." That night, Katherine lay awake on her makeshift bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through the trees, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as her mind replayed the day's events and worried over what tomorrow might bring. Outside, she knew Tucker was keeping watch from the barn, and that knowledge provided a measure of comfort. Whatever else happened, she wasn't completely alone. As dawn broke over the mountains, Katherine rose and rekindled the fire. Her back ached from the hard bed, and her feet were already swelling, a common occurrence in these last months of pregnancy. But she was determined to begin making this place a home. Tucker appeared at the door just as she was setting water to boil for coffee. He looked rested despite his night in the barn, and he'd clearly already been up for some time. "Morning," he said, hat in hand. "Hope you slept well." "Well enough," she lied politely. "There's coffee soon if you'd like some." "Appreciate that." He gestured outside. "I've been taking stock of what needs doing. The pump works fine, but the garden's gone wild. Good news is, there are some vegetables still growing despite neglect: potatoes, some onions." With a bit of clearing, you could have a decent kitchen garden. They spent the morning working side by side. Tucker repaired the sagging porch while Katherine cleared years of accumulated dust and debris from the cabin's interior. By midday, the place already looked markedly improved. As they sat in the shade of a large oak tree eating a simple lunch of bread and cheese, Katherine found herself curious about the man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. "You seem to know this area well," she observed. "Have you lived here long?" Tucker nodded. "Most of my life. My father brought us to Montana Territory when I was just a boy, right after the war. Homesteaded about 20 miles east of here." "Us?" Katherine inquired. "My parents, my sister Emma, the one I told you about, and me. Pa tried farming at first, but the land wasn't suitable. Eventually he took to raising horses." A fond smile touched Tucker's lips. "He had a way with them, taught me everything I know." "Is that what you do now, raise horses, among other things?" "I have a small ranch, nothing fancy, but it keeps me fed." He took a sip of water from his canteen. "What about you, Mrs. Rose? You mentioned St. Louis." Katherine told him about her upbringing as the daughter of a successful merchant, her sheltered life, and how she'd scandalized her family by falling in love with James Rose, a clerk in her father's company. "My parents wanted me to marry the son of my father's business partner, a merger of families as much as businesses," she explained. "When I refused and chose James instead, they disowned me, said I'd made my bed and must lie in it." "That seems harsh," Tucker commented. Katherine sighed. "They've always been practical people, more concerned with appearances and finances than with happiness. When James died, I wrote to them, hoping they might have softened, but their response made it clear I was still unwelcome unless I came back without my unfortunate condition, as they called it." Tucker's expression darkened. "They wanted you to give up your child. They suggested an arrangement could be made with a home for unwed mothers," Katherine said, the memory still bitter. "As if I would ever abandon James's baby. That's when I decided to come west." The deed to this property was among James's papers, and it seemed like Providence a place where we could start fresh. "That took courage," Tucker said quietly. Katherine smiled ruefully. "Or desperation. I'm not sure I understood what I was getting myself into. Few who come west do." He stood, brushing crumbs from his pants. "But you're here now, and we're going to make sure you can stay. Speaking of which, I should get back to those roof repairs before the afternoon heats up too much." The days fell into a rhythm. Each morning, they would work on the most pressing repairs: the roof, the windows, the door that wouldn't quite close properly. In the afternoons, when the spring sun was at its hottest, Katherine would rest while Tucker tackled heavier projects like rebuilding the corral fence or clearing the overgrown garden. Their evenings were spent in simple companionship, sharing meals and conversation by the fire. Katherine learned that Tucker had fought briefly in the Indian Wars before deciding he couldn't stomach the Army's tactics, that he could play the harmonica, though he insisted he wasn't very good, and that he had a talent for whittling, evidenced by the small wooden animals he created and left for her to find around the cabin. For his part, Tucker discovered Katherine's love of poetry, her skill at cooking despite her privileged upbringing, and her determination to create a good life for her child no matter the obstacles. On the fourth day, Tucker announced he needed to ride into town for supplies. "We're running low on nails, and I want to get some glass for that broken window," he explained. "Is there anything you need?" Katherine prepared a list: flour, sugar, coffee, and a few other essentials, and offered him money from her dwindling savings. "Keep it," he said, pushing her hand away gently. "Consider it a housewarming gift." "You've already done so much," she protested. "I can't let you spend your own money on my needs." Tucker's expression grew stubborn. My mother would turn in her grave if she knew I let a pregnant woman go without necessities when I had the means to provide them. Katherine recognized the futility of arguing with him on this point. Then thank you. I'll find a way to repay your kindness someday. No need for that. He tipped his hat and mounted his horse. I should be back before sundown. Keep the rifle close, just in case. She watched him ride away, surprised by the pang of loneliness that swept through her as soon as he disappeared from view. In just a few days, she had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, his steady reliability, the way his rare smiles transformed his serious face. Shaking off these thoughts, Katherine turned her attention to the cabin. With Tucker gone, she could surprise him by making progress on her own. She decided to tackle the built-in cupboards, which were coated with years of grime. The work was harder than she anticipated. Her swollen belly made it difficult to reach into corners, and the persistent ache in her lower back worsened as she scrubbed. By mid-afternoon, she was exhausted and overheated, her dress damp with sweat. Just a short rest, she murmured to herself, easing onto the bed. She closed her eyes, intending to rest only for a moment. When she woke, the cabin was dim with approaching twilight, and she realized she had slept for several hours. Disoriented, she sat up too quickly. A sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, making her gasp. As she stood, another pain followed, and she felt a warm rush of fluid between her legs. "No," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. "Not now. It's too early." But her body had other ideas. The contractions, though mild at first, were unmistakable. Katherine had witnessed enough births among family servants to know what was happening. She was in labor, weeks before her time, alone in a half-restored cabin miles from the nearest help. Fighting down her fear, Katherine tried to think practically. First, she needed light. With shaking hands, she lit the lamp and built up the fire. Then water. She filled every available container from the pump, knowing she would need it clean and boiling. The contractions were still far apart, which gave her hope that the labor might be slow, that Tucker might return before the baby came. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and then two, with no sign of him, Katherine had to face the possibility that she would be doing this alone. She prepared the bed as best she could, laying down clean sheets from her trunk. She found a knife and boiled it, along with a length of string for the cord. Between contractions, she moved methodically, drawing on half-remembered instructions from the midwife who had delivered her cousin's child. The sun had fully set when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her, so intense she nearly wept. Moments later, Tucker burst through the door, arms laden with packages. "Katherine, why are you still up?" "It's past." He stopped abruptly, taking in the scene: the boiling water, the prepared bed, her pale face. "The baby," she nodded, gripping the back of a chair as another contraction seized her. "It started a few hours ago. I think it's coming soon." Tucker set down his packages and was at her side in an instant, supporting her as the pain peaked and then subsided. "Easy now. Let's get you to the bed." "I'm sorry," she gasped. "It's too early. Something must have happened. The stress, perhaps, or the hard work." "Hush," he said gently, helping her to the bed. "Babies come when they're ready, not when we think they should. My mother always said that." "I'm afraid," Katherine admitted, voicing the fear that had been building since she realized what was happening. Tucker took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. "You're not alone, Katherine. I'm here, and I've helped deliver more foals and calves than I can count. Human babies can't be that different." Despite her pain, Katherine laughed at his earnest expression. "I suppose the principle is similar," she agreed. "There, that's better." He squeezed her hand. "Now tell me what you need." The next hours were a blur of pain and determination. Tucker proved to be a steady presence, following Katherine's instructions without question, providing support and encouragement as the labor intensified. He heated water, tore sheets into strips for swaddling, and held her hands through the worst contractions, never once showing discomfort or disgust at the messy business of childbirth. As midnight approached, Katherine felt the overwhelming urge to push. Tucker positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his expression a mixture of concern and resolve. "I can see the head," he told her, his voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "You're doing wonderfully, Katherine. Just a little more." With a final, tremendous effort, Katherine pushed, and the cabin filled with the indignant wail of a newborn. "It's a boy," Tucker announced, his voice thick with emotion. "A perfect, healthy boy." He wrapped the tiny infant in a clean cloth and placed him on Katherine's chest. She gazed down at her son through tears of exhaustion and joy. Despite being early, he seemed robust, with a shock of dark hair and his father's cleft chin. "Hello, little one," she whispered, touching his tiny hand. "You certainly know how to make an entrance." Tucker busied himself with the practical matters, tying off the cord, cleaning up, ensuring Katherine was comfortable, but she caught him stealing glances at the baby, his expression a mixture of wonder and something else she couldn't quite name. When everything was settled and the newborn was nursing contentedly, Tucker finally sat down in the chair beside the bed, looking as exhausted as Katherine felt. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't returned when you did." "You would have managed," he replied with certainty. "You're stronger than you know, Katherine Rose," she smiled, touched by his faith in her. "Nevertheless, I'm grateful you were here." She looked down at her son, still marveling at his perfect features. "I've been thinking about what to call him. I'd like to name him Edward, after Mr. Harris who tried to help us. Edward James Rose." "That's a fine name," Tucker agreed. "A name with character." They sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the baby's occasional soft noises. Katherine felt herself drifting toward sleep, the events of the day catching up with her. "Rest now," Tucker said, noticing her drooping eyelids. "I'll keep watch over both of you." And with that reassurance, Katherine allowed herself to surrender to exhaustion, secure in the knowledge that her son was safe, and that Tucker would be there when she woke. The next weeks passed in a haze of new motherhood. Little Edward, or Eddie as Tucker had taken to calling him, thrived despite his early arrival. Katherine recovered her strength gradually, moving from bed to chair and eventually around the cabin as Tucker continued his work on the homestead. True to his word, Tucker had stayed, though his sleeping arrangements had changed. After the birth, he had fashioned a small cot for himself in the far corner of the cabin, insisting it was necessary for him to be close in case Katherine or the baby needed anything during the night. Katherine, too exhausted and grateful to argue about propriety, had accepted this arrangement without protest. As spring deepened into early summer, the homestead was transformed. The garden flourished under Tucker's care, providing fresh vegetables for their meals. The barn was sound again, housing not only Katherine's team of horses, but also a milk cow Tucker had purchased in town, insisting that a growing boy needed fresh milk. The cabin, too, had undergone a remarkable change. The leaky roof was now watertight, the windows glazed and the chimney properly cleaned. Tucker had even constructed a cradle for Eddie, carving intricate patterns of leaves and animals into the headboard. One evening in late June, as they sat on the repaired porch watching the sunset, Eddie asleep in Katherine's arms, she broached the subject that had been on her mind for days. "You've done so much for us, Tucker. More than I could ever have asked or expected from anyone, let alone a stranger." He shifted in his chair, looking slightly uncomfortable as he always did when she expressed gratitude. "Hardly strangers now, are we?" "No," she agreed softly, "not strangers at all." She took a deep breath. "But I've been thinking. You have your own life, your own ranch. You can't stay here forever, tending to another man's widow and child." Tucker was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Is that your way of asking me to leave, Katherine?" "No." The word burst from her with more force than she'd intended. "No," she repeated more calmly. "That's not what I meant at all. I don't want you to feel obligated to stay." He turned to look at her then, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "I don't stay out of obligation." "Then why?" She held her breath, waiting for his answer. Tucker seemed to struggle with his words, a man more accustomed to action than to expressing his feelings. "Because in all my years, I've never felt more at home than I do right here, with you and Eddie." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Because I've grown to care for you both more than I thought possible." Katherine felt her heart quicken. "Tucker, I know it's too soon," he hurried on. "Your husband's not long gone and you've had the baby, and I'm just some rough cowboy who happened along at the right moment. I don't expect anything, Katherine. I just want you to know that I'm here because I want to be, not because I feel I have to be." In that moment, Katherine recognized the truth of her own feelings that had been growing steadily since that first day when Tucker had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer. She had tried to deny them, to tell herself it was merely gratitude and the natural bond that forms between people who face danger together. But sitting here, watching him struggle to express what was in his heart, she could no longer lie to herself. "What if I want you to stay?" she asked softly. "Not out of necessity or convenience, but because having you here makes this place feel like home. Because Eddie deserves to know the man who helped bring him into this world. Because She faltered, then found her courage. "Because I've come to care for you too, Tucker Lawson." The hope that dawned on his face was like the sunrise, gradual at first, then blazing with warmth. "Katherine, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that life is unpredictable and often cruel, but sometimes it gives us unexpected gifts." She shifted Eddie to one arm and reached out her free hand to Tucker. "You saved us in more ways than one. You've become essential to our lives, and if you were to consider making this arrangement more permanent, I would be very happy." Tucker took her offered hand, his own trembling slightly. "I'm not a man of wealth or education," he warned. "I can't give you the kind of life you had in St. Louis." "I don't want that life," Katherine replied firmly. "I want this one: a simple home, honest work, and a good man who cares for us. That's worth more than all the comforts I left behind." Tucker's smile was slow and sweet, transforming his normally serious face. "Then if you'll have me, Katherine Rose, I'd like nothing better than to build a life here with you and Eddie. I think," she said with an answering smile, "that we've already begun." In the weeks that followed, their relationship deepened, though Tucker, ever mindful of Katherine's reputation, insisted on maintaining separate sleeping arrangements until they could be properly married. They agreed to wait until late summer, when Eddie would be a bit older and Katherine fully recovered from childbirth. Word of their situation had spread through Willow Creek, thanks in part to Tucker's regular trips for supplies. To Katherine's surprise, rather than facing censure, they received support from the small community. The women of the church quilting circle organized a belated baby shower, bringing practical gifts for Eddie and extending friendship to Katherine. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Holloway, became a frequent visitor, bringing news from town and advice about frontier housekeeping. Even the territorial marshal, Peterson, stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to update them on the Blackwater gang still at large, but reportedly operating in Wyoming now. But really, Katherine suspected, to satisfy his curiosity about the widow and the cowboy. "You've done a fine job with this place, Lawson," Peterson commented, surveying the improvements to the homestead. "Hardly recognize it from the last time I rode by." "Katherine deserves most of the credit," Tucker replied, which they both knew wasn't entirely true but spoke to his unfailing generosity. "Well, it's good to see life returning here," the marshal said. "Too many abandoned homesteads these days. People don't realize how hard frontier life can be." Before he left, Peterson lowered his voice and added, "By the way, Reverend Miller mentioned he'd be happy to come out here for the wedding if that would be easier, what with the baby and all." Katherine blushed at the directness, but Tucker merely thanked the man for the information. After the marshal rode away, they looked at each other and burst into laughter. "I suppose there's no such thing as a private matter in a small town," Katherine remarked. "Not when it's as interesting as a city widow and a bachelor cowboy setting up house together," Tucker agreed with a smile. "Does it bother you, the talk?" Katherine considered this. "Once it would have. My parents were obsessed with appearances, with what the neighbors might think. But out here—" She looked around at the thriving garden, the repaired barn, the solid little cabin that was beginning to feel like home. "Out here, what matters is survival, community, building something that lasts. The rest is just noise." Tucker's expression softened and he reached out to touch her cheek. "You're a remarkable woman, Katherine Rose, and you," she replied, leaning into his touch, "are a good man, Tucker Lawson. The best I've ever known." The first time Tucker kissed her was on a warm July evening after Eddie had been put to bed. They had been discussing plans for expanding the garden when a comfortable lull fell in the conversation. Tucker looked at her with such tenderness that Katherine felt her breath catch. "May I?" he asked simply. She nodded and he leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Katherine responded with a warmth that surprised them both, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. When they parted, Tucker's eyes were dark with emotion. "I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you smile," he confessed. "Why did you wait so long?" she teased, though she knew the answer. "Because some things are worth waiting for," he replied seriously. "And because I wanted you to be sure." "I am sure," Katherine said, and to prove it, she kissed him again. Their wedding day dawned clear and bright in late August. True to his word, Reverend Miller rode out to the homestead, accompanied by several families from town who had become friends over the summer. Mrs. Holloway had insisted on baking a wedding cake, and the women of the quilting circle presented Katherine with a beautiful wedding quilt, each square representing a different aspect of frontier life. Katherine wore her best dress, a deep blue that Tucker said matched the color of the sky just after sunset. Eddie, now 3 months old and growing rapidly, was dressed in a tiny suit that Mrs. Holloway's daughter had sewn for him. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. They stood on the porch of the cabin they had rebuilt together, with Eddie cradled in Katherine's arms, and exchanged vows before their friends and neighbors. "I, Thomas Andrew Lawson, take you, Katherine Elizabeth Rose, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Tucker said, his voice steady though his eyes shone with emotion. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Katherine repeated the same vows, her heart so full she thought it might burst. When Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Tucker's kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would share. The small gathering celebrated well into the evening, with music provided by the blacksmith who played fiddle and Tucker himself, who finally revealed his harmonica skills, which were, as he had warned, rather rudimentary but enthusiastic. There was dancing on the packed earth of the yard, laughter, and a sense of community that Katherine had never experienced in her more formal St. Louis society. As twilight fell and their guests began to depart, Tucker and Katherine stood arm in arm on the porch, waving goodbye. Eddie had long since fallen asleep, exhausted by the excitement of the day. "Happy, Mrs. Lawson?" Tucker asked, using her new name for the first time. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "And you, Mr. Lawson? Any regrets about tying yourself to a city woman and another man's child?" Tucker turned to face her, his expression serious. "Katherine, from the moment I saw you behind that overturned wagon, something in me knew that my life had changed forever. Eddie may not be mine by blood, but he's mine in every way that matters, and as for you being a city woman—" He grinned suddenly, the smile transforming his face. "Well, I'd say you've taken to frontier life admirably." Katherine laughed and leaned against him, savoring the solid warmth of his body. "It's easier with the right teacher." Later that night, after they had put Eddie down in his cradle, they came together as husband and wife for the first time. Tucker's touch was gentle yet confident, his love for her evident in every caress. Katherine, who had only known the brief, dutiful attentions of her first husband, was astonished by the depth of passion she felt in Tucker's arms. Afterward, lying together in the darkness, Katherine traced the contours of Tucker's face with her fingertips, memorizing him by touch. "What are you thinking?" he murmured, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "I'm thinking about fate," she replied. "How the most terrible circumstances sometimes lead to the greatest joys. If James hadn't died, if my parents hadn't rejected me, if those outlaws hadn't attacked, I would never have found you." "I like to think we would have found each other somehow," Tucker said. "Some things are just meant to be." As autumn painted the surrounding hills in shades of gold and crimson, life at the Lawson homestead settled into a rhythm. Tucker split his time between their property and his own ranch, gradually moving his small herd of horses to the more fertile pastures surrounding their cabin. Katherine took to frontier life with determination and growing skill, learning to preserve the garden's bounty for winter, to make soap from rendered fat and lye, to mend harnesses, and even to shoot the rifle Tucker had insisted she master. Eddie grew strong and curious, reaching all his milestones early according to Mrs. Holloway, who had raised 6 children of her own. His first smile had been for Tucker, a fact that filled Katherine with such joy she had to turn away to hide her tears. "He knows his pa," Tucker had said simply, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Winter arrived with a vengeance in late November, bringing howling winds and snow that piled in drifts against the cabin walls. But inside, all was warm and secure. Tucker had spent weeks preparing chopping and stacking firewood, reinforcing the barn, ensuring they had ample provisions to see them through until spring. On the coldest nights, they would huddle together before the fire, Eddie sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby, while Tucker read aloud from one of Katherine's books, or they simply talked, sharing stories of their lives before they met. It was during one such evening, with snow falling silently outside and the wind whistling through the eaves, that Katherine realized she was expecting again. "Tucker," she said, interrupting his reading of The Courtship of Miles Standish, a poem that always made him chuckle at its depiction of a man too shy to court a woman directly. He looked up, marking his place with a finger. "Yes, love, I think. I believe we're going to have another baby." Tucker's expression moved from surprise to wonder to joy in the span of seconds. He set the book aside and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I recognize the signs from before. It's early still, the baby won't come until summer." Tucker laid a gentle hand on her still flat abdomen, his touch reverent. "Another child," he murmured. "Our child." "The first of many, I hope," Katherine said, covering his hand with hers. Tucker's smile was radiant. "As many as you want, my love." As winter gave way to spring, and spring to early summer, Katherine bloomed with her pregnancy. Unlike her first, this one was easy, unmarked by the stress and grief that had shadowed Eddie's gestation. Her body, having done this before, seemed to know what to do, and Tucker's attentive care ensured she never overtaxed herself. Eddie, now toddling confidently, was fascinated by his mother's expanding belly. Tucker had explained that a baby was growing inside, and Eddie would often press his small hands against Katherine's stomach, giggling when he felt movement. "Baby," he would announce proudly, one of the few words in his rapidly expanding vocabulary. "That's right, little man," Tucker would respond, tousling his dark hair. "You're going to be a big brother soon." Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth Lawson, arrived on a perfect July day with far less drama than her brother. The local midwife, Mrs. Palmer, attended the birth, but it was Tucker who caught his daughter as she entered the world, his hands steady despite the tears in his eyes. "She's beautiful," he whispered, placing the tiny, red-faced infant in Katherine's arms. "Perfect, just like her mother." Sarah had Tucker's fair coloring, with a dusting of blonde hair so fine it was almost invisible and eyes that soon turned the same striking blue as her father's. Eddie, after initial confusion about the small, noisy addition to the family, became a protective and loving big brother. Life continued to unfold in ways Katherine could never have predicted during those dark days after James's death. The homestead flourished under their combined care, expanding to include not just horses but cattle and sheep as well. Tucker's knowledge of animal husbandry proved invaluable, and Katherine's head for figures ensured they managed their resources wisely. The town of Willow Creek grew too, with the arrival of the railroad bringing new settlers and opportunities. Tucker was elected to the town council, his straightforward manner and fairness earning him the respect of the community. Katherine found herself involved in establishing the town's first proper school, drawing on her own education to help interview teachers and select books. Eddie started school at 6, riding his own pony, a gift from Tucker on his birthday, the 3 miles to town each day. By then, he had been joined by not only Sarah but another brother, Michael James Lawson, born 2 years after his sister. Through it all, the bond between Katherine and Tucker deepened and strengthened, their love tempered by the challenges and joys of frontier life. They had their disagreements. Of course, Katherine's stubborn independence occasionally clashed with Tucker's protective instincts, and his tendency toward taciturnity sometimes frustrated her need for communication. But they never went to bed angry, a rule they had established early in their marriage. 10 years after Tucker had first come to Katherine's rescue, they stood together on the porch of their home, no longer a rough cabin, but a substantial house that Tucker had built with his own hands, adding rooms as their family grew. The homestead had expanded to become one of the most successful ranches in the territory, known for its fine horses and the warm hospitality of its owners. "Remember the day we met?" Katherine asked, leaning against her husband's strong shoulder. At 40, her hair now showed strands of silver among the brown, and fine lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes, but Tucker still looked at her as if she were the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Every detail," he replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "You were the bravest woman I'd ever encountered, facing down those outlaws to protect your unborn child," Katherine laughed softly. "I was terrified, and then you appeared like some avenging angel, all steely-eyed determination." "Hardly an angel," Tucker chuckled. "Just a man who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Providence," Katherine said firmly. "That's what my mother would have called it in her more religious moments." They were silent for a time, watching their children play in the yard. Eddie, now a lanky 10-year-old with his father's quiet competence. Sarah, 8 and fierce with her mother's determination. Michael, 6 and adventurous. And the twins, Robert and Ruth, just 4 and inseparable in their explorations. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come along when I did?" Tucker asked suddenly. Katherine considered this. "Sometimes. I like to think I would have managed somehow. Human beings are remarkably resilient, but I'm infinitely grateful that I didn't have to find out." She turned in his arms to face him. "You saved more than just my life that day, Tucker Lawson. You saved my faith in humanity, my hope for the future. You gave me a reason to believe in love again." Tucker cupped her face in his weathered hands, his blue eyes as intense as they had been on that first day. "And you, Katherine Lawson, gave me a family, a purpose, a home. I'd say we saved each other." As the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their beginning, Tucker bent to kiss his wife, a kiss as full of promise and passion as their first had been. They had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, had built something lasting and true out of chance and courage and love. And as their children's laughter filled the evening air, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that the frightened widow who had once cowered behind an overturned wagon had found not just safety but happiness, beyond anything she could have imagined, in the arms of the cowboy who had fought for her and stayed.